Fast forward to November 2016, and I started noticing an uptick in right-wing talk about cultural Marxism. And while this had once come from the extremist fringe of the movement, it seemed to now be coming from the mainstream as well. It was flowing across Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and all kinds of social media platforms. And this American right-wing conspiracy theory has evidently gone global and been locally adapted in a whole range of creative and confusing ways by right-wing intellectuals elsewhere, like here, in Canada. The power of the alt-right's cultural Marxist conspiracy theory became apparent to me when Canadians started gabbing about it as well. Not just ordinary working-class Canadians, but professors too. Indeed, Jordan Peterson started retweeting stories like "Cultural Marxism is destroying America" from alt-right websites such as the Daily Caller. And since then, Jordan Peterson has been represented as a local Canadian shill for this globalizing American conspiracy theory. In about 15 minutes or so from now, I will assess Peterson's slippery usage of the term cultural Marxism. But before getting to that, I want to take some time to unpack the right-wing history, meaning, and political uses of cultural Marxism. As a trigger warning, please know that I'll be displaying a lot of hateful images and clips from alt-right news sites, videos, and social media pages in order to demonstrate how noxious and irrational this alt-right conspiracy theory has become. So what is the history of the alt-right's conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism? Well, in Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels used the term cultural Bolshevism as an anti-Semitic epithet and as a cudgel for attacking their opponents, including jazz musicians. One might assume that the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91 and the triumph of neoliberal capitalism would subdue far-right anxieties about the specter of communism materializing in America, but this was not the case. Throughout the 90s, paleo-conservative organizations and far-right groups such as Paul Weirich's Free Congress Foundation seem to have resurrected the Nazi idea of cultural Bolshevism, but they renamed it cultural Marxism. Key texts in this genre include Michael Minnicino's The Frankfurt School and Political Correctness. William Lynn's Political Correctness, A Short History of an Ideology, is perhaps the most significant work. And William Lynn seems to have made friends in high places. Here's a 2016 picture of Lynn meeting a smiling Donald Trump. So, how does the American right-wing extremist movement explain the rise of cultural Marxism in America historically? Well, most of the time they attribute this cultural Marxism to Antonio Gramsci, who, in the prison notebooks, developed a plan to win the working class consensually to the socialist project. But the alt-right then goes on to say it was only after Frankfurt School Marxist Jewish intellectuals Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, fleeing Nazi Germany in 1934, came to America and brought with them this cultural Marxism. According to the alt-right, the Frankfurt School and its disciples, such as Herbert Marcuse, influenced generations of Americans, creating the New Left and single-handedly causing the social movements surrounding feminism, LGBTQ rights, black power, anti-colonial liberation, environmentalism, pacifism, and many more to emerge in the 1960s. Then, throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, cultural Marxists had become a ruling class of sorts, exercising hegemony in civil society and finally taking control of the US federal government, the public education system, and the media and cultural industries. Once in power, this cultural Marxist elite sided with virtuous non-white people and minority groups and started attacking and undermining white cisgender conservative Christian men with doctrines of political correctness and social justice and multiculturalism. The story the alt-right tells about cultural Marxism in the United States is ludicrous. Nonetheless, this story has made a mark on the public mind. Since the turn of the millennium, derivative retellings and creative adaptations of this conspiracy tale circulate far and wide. There's even a feature documentary called Cultural Marxism, The Corruption of America, featuring figures such as Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul. But attacking political correctness and social justice is nothing new on the far right. Back in 2003, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which monitors American hate groups like the KKK, the neo-Nazi movement, racist skinheads, and Christian identity adherents, noted that the cultural Marxist conspiracy was catching on. The far right agitated against cultural Marxism during George W. Bush's two-term presidency. Then, Tea Party activists claimed that the election of Barack Obama represented a coup for cultural Marxism, while birthers framed Obama as a foreign-born Muslim who's building a Marxist dictatorship. Right-wing shock jocks and Fox News pundits like Glenn Beck echoed this cultural Marxist conspiracy theory, as did alt-right infotainment sites like Breitbart News. In Righteous Indignation, Excuse Me While I Save the World, Breitbart founder Andrew Breitbart described his discovery of cultural Marxism as a red pill. Breitbart News itself published numerous stories about so-called cultural Marxism and cultural Marxist elites, with stories with titles like Political Correctness Equals Cultural Marxism and Cultural Marxism is the Enemy, and Even Little Girls Can Be Cultural Marxists Too. A Google Trends data visualization of American search interest in cultural Marxism from November 2008 to November 2016 shows interest in cultural Marxism increasing. It trends upwards during the 2016 election campaign and spikes in the aftermath of Trump's win. Appropriately, Steve Bannon, Trump's chief strategist at the time, portrayed conservatives as under siege by cultural Marxism. Here he says, cultural Marxism is as real and dangerous now as it ever was in the Cold War, probably more so. This conspiracy theory seems to have even made its way up to the heights of state power. In the first year of Trump's presidency, Rich Higgins, the U.S. National Security Council's former director for strategic planning, bemoaned a cultural Marxist plot to turn public opinion against Trump. In a memo entitled POTUS and Political Warfare, Higgins explained Trump's unpopularity as the effect of, quote, withering information campaigns that serve as the non-violent line of effort of a wider movement to execute political warfare agendas that reflect cultural Marxist outcomes. And some Trump supporters see their man in the White House as making America great again by getting rid of cultural Marxists. The rise of the alt-right has given new life to the cultural Marxist conspiracy theory. And even Richard Spencer, the U.S.'s most prominent white supremacist who co-edits altright.com and Radix, promulgates a whole range of conspiracy stories about cultural Marxism in America. The alt-right's clown prince, Milo Yiannopoulos, even spoke of cultural Marxism in articles with headlines such as, "I've been censored and it's getting dark. How cultural Marxism locked me out of my car." In 2018, the right-wing libertarian Ron Paul retweeted, then deleted, a racist cartoon about cultural Marxism. And we now see this conspiracy theory spread across social media platforms. On Facebook, a Stop Cultural Marxism page describes cultural Marxists as people who are cancer in human form. In late 2018, the video sharing site YouTube streamed almost 174,000 videos about cultural Marxism with titles such as Nazi Rubber Duck Explains Cultural Marxism and Cultural Marxism, the Ideological Disease Destroying America and Western Civilization. Amazon.com, meanwhile, retails books about the so-called corrupting influence of cultural Marxism, and here are a few titles. But what does the alt-right really mean when it uses the phrase cultural Marxism? Well, the alt-right represents cultural Marxism as responsible for or equivalent to every idea, value, person, group, organization, product, or practice that purportedly offends, challenges, or afflicts the identities and beliefs of white conservative Christian Americans, and most of the time, those being white conservative Christian cisgendered men. Indeed, cultural Marxism is said to be the cause and the effect of social justice, of feminism, gender equality, and women's right to get an abortion or a divorce, of the very existence of LGBTQ people, of racial equality and multiculturalism, of affirmative action policy in the workplace, even at Starbucks. Cultural Marxism is furthermore said to be the cause and effect of big government, social welfare programs, gun control policies, the United Nations, the ACLU, and MoveOn.org, social movements such as Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and Me Too, Colin Kaepernick, and the NFL players that took the knee in support of Black Lives Matter. Hollywood is supposedly in on it too. Star Wars The Force Awakens is said to be cultural Marxist because of its multi-gendered and multicultural cast. For the alt-right, the universities and colleges of America are also bastions of cultural Marxism. Evidently, the alt-right's discourse about cultural Marxism is a totalizing or global conspiracy theory, as it attempts to identify or explain the singular cause or motor force behind innumerable phenomena. Of course, there is no empirical ground beneath the idea that Marxists rule the big institutions of American society. Read any history of Marxism and socialism in the United States. No Marxist or socialist party has ever achieved hegemony over the federal government, over the education system, or over the media and cultural industries. The nation's dominant common sense has been in the main quite unfriendly to Marxism and socialism, and Marxism has long been America's unofficial anti-ideology. The U.S. federal government? No cultural Marxists there.
At present, the billionaire Trump presides over the most powerful government in the world, and Trump's cabinet is full of oligarchic millionaires, while the Republican-controlled Congress and Senate are more supportive of other billionaires and millionaires and transnational corporations than they are of the working class, let alone the democratic socialists of America. Sure, some universities and colleges in the United States do hire Marxist professors, and why wouldn't they? Marx is one of the most important thinkers of all time. Yet, far from being overrun by red-tenured radicals, most universities, the Marxists within these universities at least, have marginal influence and power as compared to, say, neoliberal mind managers or business school economists. And what about the alt-right's idea that cultural Marxists preside over the nation's media and cultural industries? Well, that's absolute rubbish. Billionaires such as News Corp's Rupert Murdoch, not Marxists or socialists, own the US-based globalizing ICT and media industries, and Marxists have never seized the means of mental production or forged gigantic for-profit media companies capable of manufacturing mass consent to a working-class revolution against the capitalist status quo. Cultural Marxism is the ultimate post-factual dog whistle for the extreme right.
The alt-right's conspiracy theory can be easily debunked, and anyone who believes it is living inside the matrix. Despite its falsity, this conspiracy theory spreads around the world, shaping what people think about cultural Marxism and people it labels cultural Marxists. How then does the alt-right use this conspiracy as a rhetorical tool or propaganda weapon for organizing consent to its hate? First, the alt-right uses the conspiracy theory as a culture war strategy for constructing an American self in its own hateful image. The alt-right constructs America as essentially white, Anglo-Saxon, and European. For the alt-right, America's gender-sex regime is patriarchal, heteronormative, and centered around the nuclear family. Its religious order is Christian, its economic structure is capitalist, and the values of individualism, meritocracy, and private property are sacrosanct. For the alt-right, this is the essential America. Having constructed an idealized notion of itself, the alt-right then uses the discourse of cultural Marxism to construct an anti- or un-American other, a foil for its white supremacist ideal of its nation, of its people. The alt-right labels nonconformers to its white, patriarchal, Christian capitalist alt-American ideal as cultural Marxists. And this is a very broad label, including everyone from liberals to white social justice activists to non-white people to feminists to LGBTQ people to immigrants to atheists to Muslims to Jews to socialists and on and on. All of these are bundled together by the alt-right as cultural Marxists. The alt-right even represents elites who are not Marxists as Marxists, so everyone from Hillary Clinton to Justin Trudeau to George Soros to Pope Francis to Oprah Winfrey to Rachel Maddow can all be reduced to cultural Marxists too. The alt-right furthermore uses this discourse of cultural Marxism to construct the people it depicts as others to the alt-America as not only un-American, but also as enemy threats to America. Ron Paul, for example, says that cultural Marxism is, quote, a form of cultural terrorism against America. By depicting those people it labels as cultural Marxists as enemy threats to alt-America, the alt-right sows fear, suspicion, and paranoia about its opponents. It ignites hatred for a wide range of people that are not anti-American, and most often not even close to being Marxists. Furthermore, the alt-right agitates for violence against the people it constructs as cultural Marxists, constructing these Marxists as enemy threats to America, and representing violence as a way to defend and secure America from this threat. Now, given how flexible the alt-right's epithetical label of cultural Marxism is, anyone who does not fit into alt-America is vulnerable to being smeared as a cultural Marxist, and everyone that the alt-right demonizes as a cultural Marxist can become a potential target of a violent hate campaign to smash cultural Marxism. Now, recall how on July 22, 2011, the fascist terrorist Anders Behring Breivik, prior to murdering 77 civilians, many of which were children, called upon white people all over the world to take up arms against the cultural Marxists. Also, the alt-right uses this discourse on cultural Marxism as a tool of populism. This alt-right discourse produces alt-American people as victims of cultural Marxism, people who are being oppressed in some way by this cultural Marxist elite and its political correctness and social justice ideology. By constructing cultural Marxists as bad un-American elites and alt-Americans as a virtuous yet victimized people, the alt-right casts itself as a populist vanguard of a people's movement to take on the elite. Additionally, the alt-right uses the discourse on cultural Marxism to deny the historical and contemporary reality of sexism, racism, and classism in the United States. It makes the struggle for social justice appear to be a top-down conspiracy, as opposed to what it really is, a bottom-up community response to the real existing problems of the world. Significantly, the alt-right uses the discourse of cultural Marxism to obscure the essence of the actual elite groups in positions of structural and institutional decision-making power in the United States. Take the economy and take the state. While actual Marxists point to the owners of the big corporations as society's ruling class, for the alt-right it seems that being an elite means holding liberal ideas as opposed to holding concentrations of capital and therefore political power. And this is total nonsense. As Slavoj Žižek recently said, quote, "What people call cultural Marxism is one of the last liberal bourgeois defenses against Marxism. It is falsely radical." The alt-right's discourse distracts people from the corporate elites that exercise real power in the United States and enables these elites to proceed with business as usual, securing their profits and their power with help from two mostly compliant parties. This is very much a blue pill of and for the alt-right, which keeps its acolytes and followers inside an ideological matrix of sorts. Unfortunately, this alt-right blue pill is going global and being taken up by right-wingers around the world in other countries like Canada. Here, Jordan Peterson has been associated with the alt-right's cultural Marxist conspiracy theory. But does Peterson actually believe it? Does he perpetuate it? To the best of my knowledge, Peterson has only directly used the phrase cultural Marxism once, and this was in a video answer to a question posed by an Australian fan about same-sex marriage. The Jordan Peterson fans said that they were against the legalization of same-sex marriage in Australia because it was supposedly backed by cultural Marxists. And then they asked Jordan Peterson to explain his own views on same-sex marriage. Peterson's response was confusing, disappointing, but telling. Here's what he said. Quote, "Well, I would be against gay marriage if it were backed by cultural Marxists. But if the marital vows were taken seriously, then it seems to me that gay marriage is a means whereby gay people could be integrated more thoroughly into standard society." Peterson continued, "The problem of gay marriage is that it seems to me to be part of a wedge, and it isn't obvious to me that legalizing gay marriage has done anything to decrease the demands that the radical left and neo-Marxist types are placing on traditional society."
Like a growing faction of the political right, Peterson's fan implies that same-sex marriage is the outcome of a plot by a cultural Marxist cabal to disrupt and destroy the foundations of traditional society. And Peterson lets this ludicrous mode of explaining the rights won by LGBTQ people for equal treatment under the law go unchallenged.
That said, Peterson only directly uses the phrase cultural Marxism once, preferring instead to use terms such as postmodern Marxism. Nonetheless, in alt-right discourse and in the discourse of Peterson's fans, the terms cultural Marxism, postmodernism, and neo-Marxism are often synonymous. In this regard, it is no surprise that many young and impressionable Peterson followers don't always distinguish between the alt-right's conspiracy of cultural Marxism and Peterson's talk of postmodern neo-Marxism. There's so much confusion online. Check out the Reddit website. You'll find a full subreddit on the subreddit for Jordan Peterson. There, Peterson fans and critics alike debate his usages and meanings of cultural Marxism. Regardless of Peterson's intent, many of his alt-right followers seem to assume that their guru is giving credence to the cultural Marxist conspiracy. Just take a look around. Jordan Peterson fans all over the world are producing, circulating, consuming YouTube videos promoting Peterson with titles like Postmodernism and Cultural Marxism, Jordan B. Peterson. Marxism and Cultural Marxist Tenets, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, Political Correctness, Postmodernism, Cultural Marxism Alliance, Explained. Jordan Peterson, Postmodernism and Cultural Marxism, Within Universities. Peterson Facebook fans friend videos with titles like Smashing Cultural Marxism, Jordan Peterson is driving his critics to desperate acts. Even Andrew Anglin, one of the most infamous neo-Nazis today, is getting in on the fun, creating remixes of Peterson videos that prop Peterson up as some kind of neo-Nazi stormtrooper. On Twitter, we find lots of Peterson fans tweeting about the threat of cultural Marxism, and even though Peterson says his retweets are not to be read unfailingly as endorsements, he has retweeted stories from alt-right sites such as Cultural Marxism is Destroying America. And Peterson has retweeted videos he appears in, like Postmodernism and Cultural Marxism. Given the above, it's not surprising that in the international mainstream media, magazines like the New Zealand Listener represent Peterson as, quote, an internet sensation for his outspoken criticism of what he calls political correctness and cultural Marxism. All the while, Christian think tanks like the Interfaith Institute publish stories that depict Western religious policies being profoundly shaped by postmodernism and cultural Marxism, and then link their readers to a video talk by Peterson. I do not claim that Jordan Peterson created the alt-right conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism, nor do I claim that Jordan Peterson necessarily believes this conspiracy theory to be true. But what is evident is that Jordan Peterson, by ignorance or by choice, has amplified this conspiracy theory, and the alt-right's acolytes are lapping it up. Even outside the alt-right, Peterson's discourse may act as a gateway to the alt-right, and this needs to be challenged. When Jordan Peterson complains about middling bureaucrats and postmodern professionals with their neo-Marxist and postmodern Marxist ideology, imposing upon him ideas of social justice and political correctness and equity policy in the workplace, he casts himself as a victim. Yet far from being a victim, Jordan Peterson epitomizes an elite. In fact, he's part of the 1%er club, but he uses his power, his wealth, and his prestige not to fight for the working class, but rather to defend traditional ideas and the status quo. And the status quo is typified by radical and growing social and economic inequality. Global productivity is increasing, gross domestic product continues to rise, and corporate profits soar, but inequality between the rich and the poor is widening. At present, the wealthiest 85 people on the planet have more money than the poorest 3.5 billion combined. The richest 1% of the Earth's population owns more than half of the Earth's total wealth. The richest 0.1% of households in the United States command as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. In 1978, CEO earnings were roughly 30 times the average worker's salary. In 2017, the average CEO to worker pay ratio was a whopping 339 to 1. These unequal social conditions are the outcome of a combination of capitalist logics and political choices made by governments, and they underpin so much of the collective and individual discontent experienced by millions of people in society today. But instead of enlightening his millions of followers about the real economic and political determinations of social inequality, Peterson keeps them in the dark. Indeed, Peterson naturalizes inequality as an expression of hierarchies of competence that benefit everyone. He justifies inequality with recourse to some bogus notion of meritocracy. As he says, smart people who work hard are the ones who get ahead. And at worst, and apropos his rants against neo-Marxism and postmodern Marxism and cultural Marxism, Peterson smears those people and movements who are concerned about and are trying to solve the problem of social inequality by equating these people with a totalitarian ideology. In sum, by deflecting his followers' attention away from the source of inequality, that being capitalism and neoliberal policy choices, explaining inequality as an expression of natural as opposed to social relations, and framing left thinkers and movements as being enthralled to an evil totalitarian ideology, Peterson has distinguished himself as a ruling class intellectual. Arguably, Peterson's meritocratic message is harming those he wishes to help. As Nathan Robinson recently says, Peterson speaks to disaffected, and I would add, working-class millennial men. Yet he's offering them terrible advice, because the individual responsibility ethic makes one feel like a failure for failing. Yet millennials struggle in part because of a viciously competitive economy that is crushing them with debt and a lack of opportunity. But if you can't pay your student loans or your rent and you can't get a better job, what use is it to tell you that you should adopt a confident lobster posture? That said, I do not believe Dr. Peterson is a fascist, even though he's been associated with fascism on a few occasions. Now, Dr. Peterson, this is a message for you. Given you profess to be on the side of enlightenment, I urge you to use your intellect to inform your fans about how harmful the neo-fascist movement's blue pill of cultural Marxism is to rational discourse, to informed citizenry, and to a good society. Dr. Peterson, I challenge you to use your pulpit to warn your followers of the real threat the fascist right's blue pill poses to substantive human freedom and democracy. And as one public educator to another, Dr. Peterson, please, please, help your students get off the alt-right's blue pill. At present, the alt-right's blue pill of cultural Marxism is in mass supply, widely circulated, and very addictive. The blue pill pulls more and more users into a matrix of ignorance, but fortunately, it is being countered by another pill that enhances the human faculty to understand the source of the bad conditions of the world and galvanizes people to forge movements and build organizations that struggle to change the world and for the better. This is the red pill called democratic socialism, and it, not the alt-right's placebo red pill, has the power to free our mind from the reigning system's algorithm. This red pill shows us the ugly truth of capitalism and liberates us from the matrix of alt-right propagandists who try to sedate us with hate and distract us from class rule. After this, there is no turning back. You take the alt-right's blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and the democratic socialist left shows you how deep the rabbit hole goes. That said, I think it is important to try to learn something from Jordan Peterson's popular resonance. Jordan Peterson has a much larger following than any left public intellectual today, in print, on Patreon, and across lecture halls. It is too simplistic to explain Jordan Peterson's popularity with regard to the rise of the alt-right and its wacky cultural Marxist conspiracy theory alone. Other questions should be asked. What are the benefits of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and his self-help videos to the working people that consume this content? What can the socialist left learn from, or possibly even do with, the form of a self-help book? And how to address individuals with regard to their personal problems, but then effectively explain those problems with regard to the wider social conditions that shape them. This is one of the many challenges the democratic socialist left faces today. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks also to the organizers for organizing this conference. The New Symbolization Project, Boise DSA, and Zero Books, your work is very much appreciated. Keep up the good fight. Thank you.